The year was 1948, the year that home run slugger Babe Ruth died. It was also the year that the Paragould High School Bulldogs won the 1948 state championship in football. Also, it was the year that Christians met for the first time here on the corner of 7th and Mueller Streets. The history of the 7th and Mueller Church of Christ. It all started here at the 2nd and Walnut Church of Christ in the mid-1940s.
And it was a dream of Vance's, and he was made an elder at 2nd and Walnut about 1946, I think. It's soon after he came home from the war. And from the beginning, that was all he could talk about. He wanted to, we were pretty large and pretty well filling the building up there, and he thought they needed to have another church in town, and he wanted it in the south part of town. And so he and Uncle Roy would work on it together. And
Vance had a big part in this. He wanted a church in the south part of town, and I guess he probably was one of the first ones that started talking it up. And then the group at 2nd and Walnut decided we needed to branch out, I guess what you'd call that, and was selected this lot.
Emmett Smith was hired by the church to become the first minister.
Of course, we had people here. I was a graduate of Harding, and before I ever went away to graduate school in Peabody in Nashville, I had made arrangements with the elders of the church at 2nd and Walnut to come back here and preach for the new congregation that was being planned at 7th and Mueller.
yes, he came to 2nd and Walnut on the 25th of May in 1947 to try out for the job down here. And I can remember that date because that's the date that Nyla Jane was born. And he was there for dinner that day. And we've always been, then, since that time, been real good friends with Emmett and his wife, Emma. They were in our home a lot. In fact, it was on my dining table that Emmett and Vance drew out the plans for Crowley's Ridge Academy. They had it all drawn out there on my white tablecloth.
The land was donated by Mr. and Mrs. Rufus Cox.
There was a pasture out there, and we had cows, pigs, and chickens in there, and we were just fenced up to the, we always said the Carlisle house, you know, and then Mr. Beard owned the Carlisle house, and we just took it that he owned the corner lot, but he didn't, according to the courthouse, that my dad owned it, so Dad just said, if it's for a church and you want it, bring the deed up to date, I'll sign it over to you, and you can build your church.
Do you remember how big a lot it was?
Well, it was the whole corner lot where the first church was built, over on this corner. It was up to the Carlisle house on the other side, and it was just Carlisle just had a small lot, I think, in there. You know, Mr. Beard's lot was. But anyhow, then Emmett Smith and some men started building that house, and Mr. Smith put on overhauls and got a hammer, and he built as much as the rest of those men did. Anytime he wasn't in church, he was working on that church building.
Here is a look at the original deed. All of the elders from the 2nd and Walnut Church, along with Mr. and Mrs. Rufus Cox, have their names on it. With the proper paperwork in hand, the beginning of the new congregation at 7th and Mueller could start.
Well, we moved to, I was transferred to Paragould, and my wife went down to the little grocery store when we first moved there, and someone sat on a nail keg there and was watching them dig the foundation across the street over there, and they said those folks is building a church building over there, but it'll never go. Said they won't have enough attendance there and so on. And that's the first that we heard about 7th and Mueller. And very soon, why, we got involved with the group and to build that building.
With construction completed, opening day was set at October 17, 1948, the day the church history began for the Seventh and Mueller Church of Christ.
Because the title of my sermon was, "Let Us Rise Up and Build," from Nehemiah. Nehemiah's coming back from captivity in Babylon to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And so the theme of my first sermon at 7th and Mueller was, "Let us rise up and build." That was the theme of Nehemiah's approach. In spite of all of the opposition, in spite of all of the obstacles that were thrown in his pathway, they began to build. Different families built at different sections, and they joined the wall together until it was a whole. And then after Bildad and some of the enemies of the work said, "Why, the wall that they built here, if a fox would rise up against it, they'd tear the wall down." But it didn't work out that way. So what we built at 7th and Mueller has been pretty strong too.
Well, it was kind of exciting because when we went to Second Walnut, we didn't know too many people or anything, and it was just kind of a challenge, you know, to come down here. And then we had our 3 kids at that time, and 3, Marianne, Norman, Joyce, and they were all baptized here. And then we met a lot of people, and we just really enjoyed it.
Some of our closest friends was Travis and Hazel Blue.
Well, we were all glad to have a place of worship on this side of town because everybody went across town to 2nd and Walnut, and we were glad to get a place of worship on this side of town where we wouldn't have to go across town, because back then you didn't have this good a way of getting around as you do now.
I was 11 years old when we first began worshiping here at 7th and Mueller, and all I can remember is Dad working with Brother Emmett and working on the building. And then what I remember is where we sat in the new building, because it had wings, what I called them, to the side. And we sat on the north wing. There was about 3 or 4 pews along there next to the door that went to the outside. And we always sat over in that little area, 3 or 4 pews there. And I remember the Vaughns sat with us over in that area, and I remember their family.
This really is about how happy everyone was. Yeah. It was just such pride.
And we met on October the 17th, 1948, approximately 150 people. And we started growing from first day on. One of the things I remember real well, we had a good association with 2nd and Walnut for a few years. Through open air meetings. We'd hire a preacher for a week, 8 days meeting, and he'd preach 7th and Mueller one Sunday, 2nd Walnut the next Sunday. And in between, we had open air meeting at the corner of 7th and Court Street. This went on to about 1953 when we stopped. And I remember that real well. We had a lot of success, and I think that helped us to grow, because the people in town knew what we were doing, knew who we were.
But as I said, when I first came down here, I was sort of apprehensive because I'd always gone to 2nd Walnut. But I had donated, before I married, to the building fund for the church here. And Maythel Ellington and I came together and came to church down here. Johnny wasn't a member then. And of course, Maythel's husband wasn't a member. And we said, well, we'll go, and if we don't like it, well, we'll go back to say, well, but we loved it. We got out here, we loved it.
On the first day we met, It was the 17th of October, and it was pretty cold. Our heating system wasn't working. We hadn't finished it. So we had kerosene heaters sitting around over the auditorium to take the chill off. I well remember that. But we went on. We didn't let those things bother us.
We didn't have any water in the building, no office or no anything. So to get the communion trays, we took turns. 3 months at a time, each family would take the communion trays home with them on Sunday night. And of course that was glasses, that wasn't plastic or anything. And we'd have to sterilize those glasses, and then we'd have to make the bread. So that if you had it for that 3 months, you'd have to take it home every Sunday night, the trays, and do the trays up, and then on Sunday morning, you'd have to go back down and fill the trays and make your bread through the week and have it ready to serve, the communion bread. And I know I took my turn. I'd never made any communion bread in my life, but they told me how to make it, and I made it, and it turned out all right. So, and I remember too that the building was so small, you walk in the front door, and then on either side, just before you get to the pulpit, there was little jute out places, one on the right and one on the left. Well, on the left, we'd sit there during services, but when we had class, the women would sit, the elderly women, we called them then, they probably weren't very old, but they sat on the left, and on the right then was people like me and younger that had class. And then in the back, the men, the older men had class, sat on the very back seats. And then we had 2 little rooms just off of the pulpit where you dress for baptism, right by the baptistry. Well, they were used for classrooms because we didn't have very many people here, and they held them. We didn't have any young kids. I mean, any like teenagers. We just didn't have any.
And then when they got the building ready, I kind of worried all the time, afraid I wouldn't be here because I had a baby coming. But she cooperated and came on the 27th of September. And then on the 17th of October, when we met for the first time, was her first time to go to church. In those days, we didn't take our babies the next day after they were born. But so it was really an exciting time for me. We already had 2 other children. But Miss Greenway, I remember, Vance's mother, taught the ladies' class for years. She started in that day, I'm sure. And as far as what happened that particular day, I can't remember too well, except that I thought the building was pretty well filled. I know it was a larger crowd than they expected. They thought there would be a lot of people interested in coming, but it turned out to be just a lot more than they expected. And it wasn't very many Sundays until we had children sitting on the pulpit because there wasn't room, and we were getting crowded. And they began to bring in chairs, you know. The benches in the first building were just some old benches that they'd gotten out of some old church house somewhere. I didn't know where they came from, but they were just ordinary homemade benches. And soon after we met, though, some of the ladies started taking up funds. They wanted some nice benches. And Ms. Abney and Ms. White were the main ones that collected money for the benches.
No, there wasn't room for very many. The little auditorium, that first little auditorium there in the corner, right there at the corner of 7th and Mueller, was all we had. But we used it until we were sitting on each other, almost, before we added the big auditorium to the back.
Oh, it was wonderful, because we had kind of gone down with the idea that it wasn't going to go over. And then when you go in and all those people are there, of course I didn't know a lot of people. I knew Miss Joyce Greenway. Miss Joyce Greenway was the first person that ever came to see me at Peargoo. And she drove a green Studebaker truck. I remember that. And she came and said, "Now you all are going to come down there, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, we were." And she said, "Well, you've taught school, so you can be one of our teachers." And she started lining up, Miss Joyce started lining up teachers for that. So I did teach the first 3 grades for a long time.
And right away, they wanted to ask me to conduct a nightly meeting. And it was during that first meeting, maybe it was a little later, when Bill came, my brother Bill came for a meeting right away, early, in the early days of the church. I believe it was during his meeting that John L. Watson was baptized. And of course, many others the same way.
We'd have the same teacher all the time. They didn't change around or anything, you know. And, well, we just all loved it. I mean, it's just, there was just an atmosphere about it, all of it. Everybody was thrilled and wanted to work. And we did work, and we grew by leaps and bounds. And Miss Joyce Greenway taught the ladies, the elderly ladies class.
Well, it was a good day for me. My oldest daughter was the first one that was baptized, and Mary Lou Neal was baptized the same day. And my youngest child was 2 years old, and Elgin Hurd carried her to church that day in his arms.
When we first came to 7th and Mueller, John L. came to church all the time, but he was not a member. He went with me to 2nd and Walnut. We moved down here, he started with me. Well, the first meeting we had was not long after we started church down here. And Emmett Smith's brother, Bill Smith, held the meeting. It was I think a week's meeting. Well, one night we all came to church, and that night Bill and Emmett went home with us. So they wanted to talk to John L. Well, they talked to him and talked to him, and he was baptized at midnight. And I was holding Larry in my arms. We picked him up and brought him down here, because see, he was just about 3, and he was already asleep. But that he changed completely.
On December 5th of 1948, at a special meeting, Brothers Roy Greenway, Brother Buck Hurd, and Brother Vance Greenway were asked by the congregation to be its first elders.
After they appointed elders, they hadn't asked 2nd and Walnut about it. They were more or less the overseers of the work, supposed to be. And so they said, well, if they were going to take over and run the church, that they ought to take over the debt of the building that was still there. Of course, there had been collections at 2nd and Walnut for years to pay for it. Not for years, but for 2 or 3 years. And there was still, seems to me like the first loan was for about $18,000, but it might have been a little more. And when they met to get the money to do this, why, the elders, I don't know just which ones, I know Vance did, signed our property as collateral for the loan. And he come home and told me he'd signed our home away. But I didn't worry, because I knew it would be paid. And it was paid out early, in fact, before it was really all due. And the church just grew, and we had so many new people coming in. New Hope congregation finally stopped meeting, and the few people that were meeting down there all came to 7th and Mueller to church.
Some of the first things I remember about the first building that was built, I was about 8 years old when the building was finished. So that put Jerry about 6. or 6.5. We played in the building, and there's a lot of sand they had filled the floor with and a lot of clay in there. So we done a lot of throwing clay around at the walls and stuff, and it was stucco type thing, and they had to wire up, and we'd throw a little clay up against the wall, just being kids. Then some of the next things I remember, my mother, our mother, took care of the building for some time, and we got to help. We would, like after church on Sunday, we'd clean up things that need to be cleaned up, and then after, like during the week, we would clean up for Wednesday night, and after Wednesday night, we'd clean up again for Sunday.
My first remembrance of church revolved around my granddad, my papa. He was an elder at the 7th and Mueller, and he was also the custodian along with Gay Watson. And I can remember that I never could understand why Jerry and Donald Carlisle, and they were two of the meanest kids in our neighborhood, why they could get into the church building and go swimming in the baptistry, and none of the rest of us could. But I guess they really got a lot of water, and it took, because they're the pillars of our church today. One's an elder and one's a deacon. And they've done so much. The Carlisle family has done so much. You know, their mom and dad were active in church, and we lived right around the corner from them, so we all played together. And
we all been accused of been swimming in the baptistry. We probably did. I wouldn't say we didn't, but I don't remember that. I remember playing in the school, in the church building. We used to play in the maybe the upstairs, the upper part while they were building it. But maybe shot out a few windows after it was built. I remember one time, Miss Will Watson's wife, Miss Jim, she was cleaning the building, and I had a BB gun, and I was going to get just as close as I could get to the corner of the window without hitting it. But you know what I did? I hit it in the window and broke the window. And she came out and gave me a good chewing out, and which she should have. But anyway, the Carlisle boys, we're kind of like the Jesse James bunch. We got blamed for a lot of things we didn't do. You know, a lot of things we did do, but a lot of things we didn't do. But
well, Fay and his wife lived hard by the synagogue. They lived right over in that old frame building there. And I may be talking out of school to embarrass your daddy. But he and his brother were over there swimming in the baptistry.
I think he still gets accused of that today. I mean,
Yeah.
it happened.
Yeah. I know it happened because I caught him. Yeah. Yeah, they were quite a pair. They were mischievous. They were fine lads that never did anybody any harm, but they just they had their fun. Fay and Lillian were a wonderful couple.
That I taught from I guess the first Sunday on, the first 3 grades. And we had, you remember, we just had 2 classrooms down at the front. You remember that? And then first they put me, and then Brother Watson come in, he said, "Can you take another grade?" I said, "Yeah." Of course, we weren't all that many, but I think I taught, the biggest class I had was about 18. But that's the first 4 grades I had in one room, in one of those little rooms.
Of those first early years, I can remember some things, and there were not a lot of classrooms. There were 2 in the back, and over on the south side, the one at the back also used for a nursery. We had the kids that were my age. There wasn't a lot of us, and Dorothy Parker taught that class. And so to get us to be really good and listen, she would promise us that as quick as the Bible story was over with, we could read Little Black Sambo. And we would be good because we wanted to hear that story about Little Black Sambo again. And every one of us in there could remember and quote that story about Little Black Sambo. And so she was one of our early teachers. The auditorium wasn't real large, and my grandpa Pilla sat at the very back on the, which would have been the north side. And he walked with a cane, and so I'd like to sit back there with him because, you know, you could kind of play with that cane. That was pretty neat. I didn't know if anybody else had a cane. Now, my grandpa Watson, he sat up to the front, and so then I would go sit with him then sometimes too. It seemed like I enjoyed sitting with, I guess, my grandparents more than I did with my mom and dad.
It's Joyce Greenway teaching me in class. One thing that I remember, she always brought us candy bars. I remember Zagnut. Have you ever heard of a Zagnut? I don't know if they still sell them or not, but that's what she used to bring us, and we really enjoyed her class. She did a good job. And
well, I had the first baby shower that was given here at 7th and Mueller. Gay Watson mentioned one day to me that the women, older women, said, we'd like to start giving showers. And she said, well, you better hurry if you want to give Matha one.
I remember on our way home from worship that first Sunday, we commented about the building, and we said that it was already too small because it was full that day. We had almost capacity, and we said we were going to have to build a bigger building the first Sunday that when we were going home.
The church was beginning to grow by leaps and bounds, and with that growth became the need for a new building.
That was an experience too in building that auditorium. Brother Tate, Robert Tate's father, lived up on the hill there by Futrell, and when we were going up in with that second auditorium and joined those big laminated beams together at the top, and Brother Tate would come by from up on the hill where he lived up there. He said, it'll never work. He said, it'll never work. Said these beams just not going to won't hold that load. Of course, we just had, I don't know how far they were apart, but we didn't have too many of them in that whole big building there. And we spanned those big beams with double tongue and groove western cedar, tongued and grooved in two places.
Really?
And we put those things together with spikes about 10 inches long. And we'd drive them down into the laminated wood. It worked. Still working. Still holding it up. We've had some big loads. Of course, that's a steep roof, and snow wouldn't stay on it too much, but we've had some pretty big loads of ice and snow on it, but they never did sag. The roof never did sag. It's just held there. So we've done many, many things to be grateful for, and all of this with the help of volunteer labor.
I remember when we started, which is auditorium number 2 now, I thought, boy, this is great. We were all in this little cramped building, and boy, we really looked big time then. It was a big, tall building, and it kind of looked like pictures you'd see of what church buildings really ought to look like, you know. And so I would come down here during the summer at the time, and I'd find all of the nails that were bent, and I'd gather those up, And on that back corner of that new building on the south side, I would throw them all in one spot. I'd pick up nails from everywhere, and I'd go throw them in that one place. And then when the subfloor was down, of course, nobody could see those nails. The interesting thing about it then, many, many years later, when we tore that subfloor out, because we had the new auditorium finished over here now that we're all in, and we were going to build classrooms. That's what I wanted to see when we tore that subfloor out, and there was those nails still there from many years before when I was a kid, and threw all those nails in there.
Well, it was built in 1954. We outgrew the first one pretty quick, and the second auditorium was mostly built by labor of the congregation, working at night. I know, pouring the concrete foundations, putting the top roof on it. I think we did have a main carpenter do on the inside, Brother Fable Johns, I believe, was finished carpenter. But very, very much of it was donated labor by the members here. And other people donated time and labor too. So we got it built. I don't remember what the cost was, but it was very, very reasonable.
I worked 10 hours a day on my regular job, and then work here. Not on the, I worked more on the second auditorium. Me and your granddad, Fay, building that school, worked 10 hours a day. Besides, it'd be midnight pretty much every night before I get to bed or later.
See, we lived across the street then, and the men would work at their regular jobs all day and come and work here, and then the ladies of the church would serve supper to them, and they'd work until late at night. And we all felt so close to each other, and those men worked so hard. Women did too.
When Brother Smith was here, you worked. I mean, you know, he worked, and he didn't expect anything less. You know, he just, whatever he asked you to do, you just did it because, I mean, he was right out there beside you, and he was doing the same thing. So I think, you know, he was just such an active part and such a role model, and really demanded when they were building the building. My dad was not a member of the church, but now Brother Smith never made any, you know, difference. He treated my dad just as good as anybody else, and my dad had a lot of tools, and he didn't ever ask him. He'd just go over there and get his tools, and Daddy'd say, I'll tell you what, he's going to tear everything I've got up. And he said, if he takes it, you'll never get it back. But Daddy never did get mad at him. You know, he never did say, well, he can't have it. And if he came home and the garage was open, he'd say, well, that Emmett's been here again, you know. So he was just that kind of person. He could just deal with everybody.
The second auditorium, I know a lot of people mention that, probably the big tall one over there now. I was in the electrical business then. I used to go out and work all day from early until late, but I'd never go home whenever I got off from work. I'd come over here and drive nails or do something until it got so dark we couldn't see. And I wasn't the only one. There's a lot more of them. Has probably told you that if there was very many here. But that was built almost entirely with donated labor. My brother-in-law, Flavel Johns and Early Johns, they were carpenters. They done some of the trim work, something that required just a little bit finesse on it. But most of that building was put up by different ones that went to church here.
Like it's probably been said before, that we've used mostly members' work that built that building, hauling concrete up a scaffold to try to get into to pour the floor. Remember Don and I used to had done that, and I remember one time I was pushing a wheelbarrow up and I had too much in, and it didn't make it up. It spilled out. But people spend a lot of time doing that. Now our society is so fast-paced that we don't have time. We want to hire somebody else to do it. But back then, we like I said, the people just didn't have the money, so we had to utilize help like that.
The new building, well, they started in shopping for pews, and they couldn't find just what they wanted. And I don't know where they heard of this manufacturing company in Wisconsin. But there was 2 or 3 of the men went up there to see them, and they'd picked them out from a catalog, I think. And they went up there to talk to them and to see about it. Well, it was just a prohibitive price, they thought. So they, because now they were going to be solid oak benches, dark oak. And so they went up there and they mentioned the fact they were going to ship them knocked down, and then they'd put them together down here. Well, they asked how much it would knock off the price if the men here would put them together. And I don't remember how much, but then it got it down into a figure that they thought they could handle. And so that's what they did. They brought their trucks like they always delivered, and they sent 2 men with the truck. And when they got here, why, they unloaded them in the auditorium, and it was fairly finished, I think. And then the men would meet here at night. And these 2 men showed somebody, probably Flavel Johns, how they went together and all. And then one would teach another until they got it to where, and they were put together with screws. And they were a good, sturdy, comfortable benches. They were really a comfortable church bench.
And I guess my all-time hero has been Emmett Smith. He did so much for all of us. He was the preacher. He was the personal worker. He was the youth minister. He was the transportation director, because my older sister got to do all the things with the youth group. He would come to the house, he'd pick everybody up, and he'd bring them back home. He knew what you liked and what you didn't like. He just could remember everything about you. And he was one of those people that made it his business to let you know how much he cared. And Miss Emma was probably one of the best Bible teachers I ever had. She was the teacher. When she came in the room, everybody got quiet. They just respected her, and they knew that she really cared about them and that she had things she wanted you to do and things she wanted you to learn.
You worked about every night doing something. Not just me, but the preachers and the elders and a lot of the men worked every night.
See, he stayed at John L. Station a lot and did a lot of his meeting people and planning things, using John L.'s phone and so car and everything, his pickup truck. One day he came down to the station. He was fixing to go to work in the building of the school. Well, he had baling wire for to tie his shoes up. He didn't even have his shoestrings. And I'm telling you what, John said everybody loved him. And everybody come by, so they got the biggest kick out of him having his shoes tied up with that baling wire. But now that's just the way he was. Whatever was available, that's what he used. I've got pictures of him and some of John L.'s workers. He'd come down there, and they weren't members of the church. I remember that, and I know that everybody that traded with John L. just loved him better than anything, and which was good for the church, and of course that's all you could hear. Everybody in town talking about the church, the school, and Emmett. And so that got the other people to thinking, It
was, we all went down to Round Island, Big Island, down there with trammel nets. We had 2 of them. Now, it was against the law to put them any closer than a certain amount of feet, like 5 or 6 feet, whatever the law was. But my dad, and Jerry's dad, and John L. Watson would go ahead of the net that was being drug down the ditch, the river, the creek. There's 8 Mile Creek, and was sticking their arms way back underneath the bank, and every once in a while would come out with a big catfish. Mostly what we got with the net was carp buffalo. They was, I don't know, probably 75 or 100 people on the bank, women and all, and they just had kettles, iron kettles, and they was cooking fish. We had the biggest fish cooking that you might have ever seen.
This was all members of the church?
This members of the church. And, but we caught hundreds of pounds of fish. But Daddy and John L., they was the ones that had the they go after it to get out and lay down on their, just nearly put their face on the water and reach back under there and pull out a catfish under that bank and pull it out and throw it up on the bank, and they clean it and eat it. We had a really big time. I remember that as a young boy.
What period of time was that? What year?
That was in the 50s, 52, 3, somewhere there. It might have been, seemed like it was in connection with maybe finishing this building. I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly, but it was in the early 50s probably.
You worked about every night doing something. Not just me, but the preachers and the elders and a lot of the men worked every night.
I never asked anybody to do anything I wouldn't do myself.
I'd say the one thing that made Emmett stand out with everybody was that he wouldn't ask anybody to do anything that he didn't do. He was there before you were, and he was doing all the most bigger things. He didn't pick out something that had a little prestige to it. He'd do anything. If there's a ditch needed digging or whatever it was, why, Emmett was the hardest worker on the job usually.
And that was one thing. We always had a lot of parties down here. Vance tried to organize the parents to where they'd invite the kids in for a party. Tried to have one once a month. And we had some at our house. I remember those. And Jerry and Donald can tell you about them. They can remember parties at the Greenways.
I remember we went out there one time with Vance. He always was good about taking kids to his home and taking kids on trips, and he was right with them, and was from having fun. And we were out at Klein's Pit. That's just out off of 49. And I heard a scream. And I looked, and there was it looked like a monster of a bird jumping across one of those gullies. And what it was a peafowl. I didn't know they was out there, but it scared me. It scared us all because it looked like something out of a spook movie, But I can remember that as a kid. But he took us out to Stanford to those Big Rock. Yeah, he had places he'd take the kids in their classes, and Vance was always, he knew how to handle kids. He knew what they liked, and then he expected you to listen in your class, but he also, and that he's going to reward you with some kind of a picnic at his house, or he would go out of his way. Him and Burnell both would go out of their way to have kids in their home, and Vance is going to be missed.
With the completion of Crowley's Ridge Academy in 1953, plans were then made to start work on the children's home.
One evening, Emmett Smith, Vance Greenway, and myself, and I don't remember, there was another one, I can't recall who the other one was, that were sitting around the kitchen table there at Vance Greenway's house. And then Emmett had been talking about child care work and just kept saying, we must get something done. So that was the beginning of it, really. And he got us interested, and the rest of us went ahead. And so the first thing you knew, Hayden Carter had come into the picture, and he was a builder, and he and his family were very much interested in the progress of the church. So Hayden bought the land out there and then donated part of it, and we all went out there and worked day and night to build the first house, first home there at Children's Home.
But the main reason that we got started on it as quickly as we did, there were 4 children that had to be placed in a home, and our mother and daddy took them in their home, and they kept them. They were just supposed to keep them until their parents could either work out something, or one of them went up north and was going to come back and get them. Well, they didn't come back and get them. So our mother and daddy kept them for a pretty good while, and it was kind of an ordeal because they were getting older, you know, and so they just said we were going to build a children's home anyway, so we're going to get started on it sooner. And so they did start the children's home then.
And then when they started the children's home, the school was pretty well started. Vance was one of the original board members at the school for 5 years. And then they came along and we needed the children's home. Well, he kind of took the reins because he told me one day, he said, Burnell, others will carry the school, but nobody will do this. So I'll take the children's homes. So he took them over from the first and was the superintendent. Of course, that was in agreement with the elders and all that he do that. But our whole life has been centered around the children's home.
On the third Sunday in July of 1955, Brother Ray Wright came to work with the Seventh and Mueller Church of Christ.
Well, he came with the school. And Emmett, of course, has a way of compelling people to come. You know, the Bible says go out and compel them. Well, he persuaded Ray to come to work in the school. And so when he did, well, that was a wonderful opportunity for us for a song leader. And we had beautiful singing because we were so crowded in that little building.
Ray Wright, what I remember about Ray Wright, he was always late. Ray Wright, I heard him say, he said, I can get up and have an hour's head start on getting ready and I'll be late every time. That was just him to be late. He was an excellent song leader.
He came up, we had built a new house on Park Street. He drove up to my house in a pretty bad car and said he wanted to work for the children, work for school, Christian school, and he understood we were going to open a Christian school. I said, well, come in, I'll call Emmett. So I called Emmett, and Emmett came, and they made a trade like that, and they moved in. Travis got Ann a job with Bland. Didn't they have Dr. Pepper? Whoever had Dr. Pepper. And she worked there till she left.
They offered me a raise from 75 to 80 a week. And Ray Wright was there doing the singing and doing a lot of wonderful work. And I refused the $5 increase and insisted that they give it to Ray. Yeah, he was worth a lot more than they ever paid him.
Ray said to me one day, I kept the children, and he said, if I just had $5 more, I could live good. Well, that just shocked me to death. And so who did I tell, Vance? Or Amy? Anyway, I told somebody, I said, can you imagine anyone just wanting $5? Because we always wanted more, you know. And they did give him the $5, and he was just as happy as he could be. But now they could get by on less than any people I've ever known and be happy. I never saw Ray fuss or anything about money. It's just there. Okay. He's a happy person.
The work of the church continued at the Seventh and Mueller Church of Christ. Other churches branched off from the original congregation at Seventh and Mueller, and those congregations include the Center Hill Church, which began in January of 1961, and the Walcott Church of Christ in June of 1952.
We were there with the congregation 10 years, and then when Vance Greenway and I don't mean Vance, but Hayden Carter and I were there as elders, and we decided to go to Center Hill and build a congregation there, and we took Chalmer Van Reenen as another one. So we went out there, and people did the same thing they did at Seventh and Mueller. They were interested in digging a foundation and going to work and working nights after work hours. They'd come there and work, and we built that building. And we had to meet over in the academy
for a short time until we finished that. But we didn't have a regular preacher, so Hayden and I and Chalmer and I don't remember who all would take time about preaching. We just pushed things along, and Center Hill was really valuable for that community out there.
Brother Roy Greenway wanted a church at Walcott. So he went out there and traveled from here and other places and started the church at Walcott. And it started growing just immediately. We built right back up where we were. We had some of our members living at Center Hill, and they wanted to start a congregation at Center Hill. Now, this was a few years after we started here. One of our elders that was then, Travis Blue, he lived out there, so they started the church at Center Hill. They started growing and still are growing, so it makes you feel real good at the progress we have made over the 50 years.
Of course, we've had a part in starting the work at Center Hill, starting the church at Walcott. Roy Greenway was one of our elders at 7th and Mueller, and he gave the land out there by his house at Walcott to build the church building, and that's where it is now, still there. Good country congregation at Walcott. They're still doing a lot of good. And of course, Center Hill, you know what the history of Center Hill, and all of that's gratifying. All of that's gratifying.
It became necessary for Brother Emmett and Brother Ray Wright to resign their positions here at 7th and Mueller in 1965. In December of 1965, a new minister was added, Brother Doug Kostowski.
We spent some wonderful years with you from 1965 to 1968. That was kind of in the middle of the 50-year span. And until this day, you are dear and near to us, and many of you are in touch with us from the 7th and Mueller Church, even until today.
Well, they were young, but one sermon that he did that has always stayed with me, and I've told others about, is Christ's death on the cross. And he got out in front, and he just almost lived it. It was just so real. Anyone there had to understand it.
I remember Doug, you know, coming and how dynamic he was. You know, he was a man that just could keep your attention.
Naturally, we hated to lose Brother Emmett, but Doug just came right in, and he fit in just real well. He and his wife, they were young, and they worked with our young people, and I liked that because we young people need someone to work with them, and I was real glad that they were that they took in the young people and worked with them. I have known of Kathy taking the older girls on bicycle rides, and they would have picnics and get-togethers, just something that didn't cost very much, and Doug would take the boys and do things with them, and the young people just loved them, and we sure hated it when he had to leave.
I think Doug Kostowski came here after Emmett did. He was the next one. And Brother Vance located him. I don't know, I don't remember just how that occurred about that, but seemed like that Brother Emmett felt like that he had other callings to do.
I remember one 4th of July, Doug and they had a new baby, and we had Andrea, and they came by and so let's just go somewhere. I don't remember where all we went. Went to Wapella Lake and round. Didn't take any extra milk. You know, didn't take any extra thing with us, and I don't know how we survived. But anyway, we stayed all day long, and we went up to some acquaintance of his up in the hills somewhere, and visited them a while. But it was a memorable trip. But we weren't expecting to be away. But Doug was somebody that would do something, like I say, on the spur of the moment. I remember he, one time for our anniversary, he and Kathy took us to Memphis, and Dad and I to Memphis to eat at a place over there and go to a movie. So he was a very friendly man. I remember him and had some fond memories of him and Kathy and their children.
In early 1968, Doug Kostowski and his family left the 7th and Mueller Church. It was then, in July of 1968, that Brother Claude Lewis came.
When Vance Greenway came to the Northside Church in Benton and spoke in the interest of the children's home, and he heard me preach, or at least speak, before he made his report that night, and he asked me if I'd be interested in moving to 7th and Mueller. And when I went up to visit and preach and so forth, it worked out that we would move there in July of 1968. So it was through Vance's contact and through my interest in the children's homework and so forth that brought us to Paragould.
Claude was a friend of Travis Blue, I believe. That he was the one that, as far as I remember, he was the one that brought Claude up as a prospect whenever he needed a preacher. And I think maybe he went and talked to him. Him and Vance both, probably.
Well, Claude Lewis. Claude, my wife's folks taught a lot of Claude Lewis. They didn't attend church. But they thought enough of Claude Lewis that when my father-in-law did, that when his daddy died, he asked him to preach his funeral. And you know, they never did get very close to the church, but they were closer than people probably knew. And Claude Lewis was a big part of that.
Brother Claude became one of the elders here, one of the finest men I've ever known. He had a very good family, and he and his family was a great access to any congregation.
Well, I remember the friendliness of the people and the hospitality and the cordial response that the people gave. And it was a congregation that was involved in a lot of different things, in mission work and, of course, the children's home benevolent work. And it was a program of work that I was interested in and I was glad to have a part of.
I can remember with him, he had a big family. It was kind of a unique experience as he came in and brought all of his kids, and some of them had gotten old enough at that time they were already off at college, and so I didn't get to know all of them, but him and his wife truly is what you call maybe the minister and the wife with Madge, and he was a very well-grounded man who was soft-spoken at times and seemed to know what the needs of the people were. His family was just a family that you want to look at and say, that's what I want my family to be like. I think he was a great example to the families here at 7th and Mueller because of his children and what they represented and what he brought here. And he gave a stableness that we needed and that growth that we had gained. I think he brought that growth along and kept us a very strong church while he was here.
In the early part of 1970, the elders met together and began talking about building a new building. On April 4th of 1971, the Building and Grounds Committee met together with the elders and broke ground for the new third building.
Another memorable thing is when we had the official groundbreaking for this new auditorium, my father, who was an elder, and my grandfather, who was an elder, was both there for that groundbreaking, and that was a real good memory for me even to this day.
I can remember my grandfather, who was an elder here and who worked as a janitor for several years in the second auditorium. The baptistry we had there was just wooden box with tar inside all over it to keep the water from leaking, and it still leaked, and it was difficult to keep clean. And right before he passed away, we were building the new auditorium, and they'd put the baptistry in, and I can remember bringing him up here before we'd ever moved in. They were still doing construction, and he was amazed at a baptistry that looked like that was going to be such.
Yes, I remember the groundbreaking ceremony, and we had photographers out to take pictures of the groundbreaking and the start of that. What is it? An 800-seat auditorium, I believe it is. And so it was an exciting time when we started that. I remember, of course, the elders that were there, and Vance Greenway, and Noel Jeton, Gus Eubanks, and John McDaniel, and also John L. Watson. John L. Watson and I were appointed elders at the same time. Of course, it was soon after that that we decided we needed a new auditorium. And it was during the 5 years that I was there that we built the auditorium that you have now. And it was a big and a great addition to the work there. I remember the Perkys. In fact, Don Perky became the chairman of the building committee. And of course, remembered the Carlyles, you know, Jerry and Don, and others who served as deacons of the congregation.
The completion of the third building was on March 12, 1973.
Yes, we had invited George S. Benson used to be the president of Harding University. He was retired then, still the chancellor, I think, of Harding. I know he was of Oklahoma Christian for a while, but he came and was the featured speaker at the opening service. We had some trouble with the PA system the first day, and we didn't have as good a reception from the pulpit as we'd like to have had, but I think it was all right. We got by with it anyway. And that had to be redone. And Brother Benson came, though, and spoke that day, and it was an exciting day.
In 1973, Brother Claude Lewis and his family left the 7th and Mueller Church. It was then that Brother Eddie Lewis came to 7th and Mueller.
Well, I came in April of 1973 and was there until April or May of 78, the 5 years that I was there. And when I first came, the elders were Gus Eubanks and Vance Greenway, Noel Jeton, and John McDaniel, and John Watson.
I remember going to a little church over here in eastern Arkansas, now where I can't think. Vance and I went over there on a Wednesday night to see Eddie Lewis and talk to him about coming here. He was out of college, out of regular college, and he had gotten a job at this little place so he would be close to the graduate school in Memphis, and he was getting his graduate degree, and he was about to finish it, I think, when he came here. And so we went and talked to him about coming to 7th and Mueller. I remember that. He came. That was the way. And this was pretty close to the first big church. Well, it was the first big church that Eddie had.
I remember when we first met Vance. He came down to Kaiser, where I was preaching at the time, and he's sitting in his car outside my office. I didn't realize he was there, and was listening to me practice my preaching. I was in my office preaching a sermon and all, and after I finished, he came and knocked on the door, and he asked me if that's the way I preached all the time, and I told him, well, basically, yes, you know, and so that's when he invited me to come and talk to the church in Paragould. And
Eddie was just kind of back to another fellow who had a lot of energy and a lot of ideas. Eddie may have been one of the most, of all the preachers since we've been here, had some of the most unique ideas of any of the preachers that we had, in the way he would approach getting people excited about doing things. He always had some kind of program. He was trying to excite people and get them involved and to reach out for other people. And we hit another spurt of growth while Eddie was here, and he always had energy, not just in the pulpit. Eddie was energetic no matter wherever you saw him, and he was a younger one. His family was younger, but again, he and his wife were something that we needed. It just seemed like the Lord was looking out for us, something we needed for another boost of growth that we experienced while he was here.
The work there, I was involved with the education program as the education director, and so some of the men that I remember were the ones that were on the education committee, which was Raymond Meadows and Wendell Eubanks and Johnny Luker. I don't know if y'all remember Johnny or not, but he was the director of the children's home for a while. And then also Frank Reddick was on the education committee. And some of the plans, you know, that we made, and some of the goals. The new education wing was first talked about when I was there, and then also I remember some other things that they did in terms of the building. One was they remodeled the old auditorium while I was there. I remember Buddy coming up there and knocking a hole in the side of the auditorium. Do you remember that? And bringing in a bunch of dirt, and we gutted the old auditorium, and he came in and knocked a hole in the side of the wall and brought in his tractor and was moving dirt around. Then they concreted it, you know, and then built the upstairs in the old auditorium where we had the children's Bible hour.
So, but he always smiled, you know, he was always smiling. She was too.
Yeah. Eddie Lewis and various others, Doug or whoever, would set these goals, and probably Eddie was as good about that as anybody. And he'd have his thermometer up there and how many we was going to have, and we'd make our goals. And we're talking about, this was some years ago, we'd have 800 or 900, and sometimes the goal was 1,000. We even pushed over 1,000, I believe, in some of those years.
Seventh and Mueller has always been a congregation that has been willing to help the community. And on June 9th, 1974, the busing program started here at Seventh and Mueller.
Well, we went to down to Truman to look at the busing. We had all heard about bus stories, and we began to read books, and we began to read periodicals of how everything was doing.
The elders decided to start a busing program. All the churches were doing it, and so they were doing it at Truman. So they asked Johnny if he'd go down there on a Sunday and just visit and go on the bus and see how they operated. So Mark wasn't very old, you know, and so he took Mark, and they went down to Truman and rode their buses and found out all they'd done. Well, they went back the next Sunday. And so then when Johnny got back, then they started working on starting a bus program. And so it's been going ever since.
Well, the bus ministry started in, I guess it was about June the 9th in 1974. And we went over to Truman to check out their busing ministry and see how see how they conducted themselves, and because they had a real dynamic busing program at the time, and from that time on we started with one bus, and it gradually went up. I don't remember how many buses we had at our peak, probably 9 or 10, but it was a good time because it got a lot of people involved in doing things that weren't maybe not normal for them to do what they were doing. And we had people that became captains and bus drivers and workers. And at that time, we went around on Sunday morning. I mean, we drove the bus on Sunday morning and Wednesday night. And also, we went out on Saturday and tried to recruit the children. So it took a lot of time. We had a lot of get-togethers, parties for them. We took them to Craighead Forest one year and had a bunch of kids that went over there. and it was just a good time, and had a lot of involvement, which with the busing program still going, and still a lot of involvement in it.
And so some of our elders visited. We visited actually in Truman at a congregation there, Viva Drive, and rode their buses once. And our elders decided it would be a program that was needed to be started here. And just happened to be that I got on one of the buses that had a great group of people that worked together with David and Liz Acuff and Frank and Diane Reddick and Jackie Sturgeon and Jill Lashley, a couple of teenagers at that time, who rode with me and Lynn, and was lucky enough to be involved in a program from day one, from the growth of 2 buses. And probably it's difficult to know in the Lord's Church, keeping up with all the congregations across the nation, but we may be one of the longest continual of running a bus program of any congregation in the nation. And it took a lot of work. We ran them 3 times a week there. When we first started, we ran them on Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. And Telfer Campbell was a big plus in that, and helping us out in new ideas. And
a turning point, I think, for a lot of us in our age group. In '74, I was like 34, and the little kids over at Truman, I can remember one little girl getting up in my lap and want to hug my neck. I couldn't hardly stand that. That really got me. We started busing, and I don't know how long Jerry was on the bus. I drove a bus for over 10 years, and felt like that when I didn't go to get on the bus, that I was skipping church.
Of course, one other program that I was involved in real heavily was the bus ministry, and of course the men that were involved in that. The first bus captains that I remember were your dad, Jerry Carlisle, and then Larry Watson, Phil Camp, Chester Daniels, and then Laryl Austin were the men that were involved in that, and of course Telfer Campbell was the one that directed it and all. And I can remember us meeting on Saturday and going out and knocking doors. And of course, being the minister, I was involved with it, and would have a devotional first and then lunch, and you know.
We had a nucleus there of bus people that would be willing to work in a busing program. Now, we bought a bus, and we bought it in Conway, and they would let us come down, drive the bus, and get it all lined out, figured it was good enough. So then they would scrape the paint off of it and paint it for us and put Seventh Mueller Church of Christ on it, and then the busing program, Joy Bus.
It was something that really ignited the church, you know. When I first came there, we had around 425 or so, and then because of the busing program, and Seventh and Mueller was one of those churches that actually worked the busing program like it should have been worked. And as a result, not only did they bring in a lot of children, but they were able to convert and reach a lot of the parents from the buses. And when I left, we had around 775 or 780. Sometimes we would reach 800, you know, in attendance, and through the busing and the converts that were being done. And it was quite a program. And I guess one of the things, too, that I remember about Seventh and Mueller was that the people there, they all really were interested in working, and they didn't mind sacrificing for the work and giving of themselves, and just many people were involved, you know.
They began on the first day, I suppose, the first day of the busing program, which was a Sunday, and Saturday, and we were doing some canvassing, and we had they selected me then to be the bus director out in and I, and we did that for several years.
So one was with Telfer Campbell and his involvement in the bus ministry, and I guess one of the things I learned from Telfer was the giving spirit. When he took on the bus program, you know, they allowed him to kind of do it the way he wanted to do it, and as a result of that, you know, man, he would encourage those bus captains and make sure those buses were running great, you know, and just gave of his time and money and effort and made that a very successful program, you know.
Busing has been, I think, one of the things that has picked up the church here at 7th and Mueller as much as anything I mean, a program that has worked as good as any program that we've ever had, that will make everybody want to work together and work as a group. We had lots of people. I'd have to say how many people was working the busing program. But now, with old Vance, he told us like it was, but we didn't want to listen. He said, you better swap up because you'll burn out. Well, guess what happened? A lot of us burn out. 10 or 12 years into the program, we said, hey, you know, it's just about to dry up, or we're going to have to just kind of quit it. Well, there was a few people, just a little sprinkling of people, didn't want to do it. Roy was one of them. And since that, as it died down, and now it's on its way back up. Roy's done a good job, and the people around him have done a good job, and it just takes some dedicated people to make it work, and that's what's happened.
Is Wendell Eubanks. And I guess probably the reason I remember Wendell so much is when we had the bus program, he was one of those fellows that said that he would buy a bus for the church. Okay, and he bought this bus, and they had it all fixed up, and he needed a bus captain, so he came to me and wanted me to be the bus captain for the bus. And so Wendell and I operated this bus. I think it was number 8 or 9 or one of the later models, you know. And as a result of that, we had a country route. We'd drive out through the country, and so him and Jenny and Karen and Kevin and Sarah and all the family, you know, and my 2 girls, they would all go out and on Saturdays, and we'd knock doors and visit with people. And
in 1977, Jim Short and his family moved to Paragould.
21 years ago, I was working for a congregation in Walker County, Alabama, part-time and teaching school full-time, and had never even heard of Paragould, Arkansas. One Sunday morning about 8 o'clock, my phone rang. I was getting ready to go to worship, and it was Eddie Lewis. He introduced himself over the phone, told me that he had heard that I was looking for a full-time bus ministry job, which I was not, because I didn't even, I was not interested at that time in doing full-time work, but he told me that they'd gotten my name from someone else and had suggested that I might do a good job for them, and so I agreed to come and interview. We came up in November of '76, spent the weekend at Rick and Lynette Watson's house, and I did children's worship that morning, and then went out to eat with everybody and talked with the elders that afternoon, and they offered me the job, and I told them I would think about it a while, and I thought about 2 or 3 weeks and called them and told them I didn't want the job, and then a couple of the elders, Noel Jadon and Dwayne Towell, came to Alabama and talked to me, gave me a couple more weeks to think about it, and after a lot of prayer and a lot of discussion, we decided this is where we needed to be. So we moved here on February the 1st, 1977. Ashley was 1 month old exactly when we moved here. We stayed 21 months and decided that we wanted to go home, except what we didn't realize when we got back to Alabama was that we had just left home. So we stayed there 10 months and moved back here, and we've been here ever since. And the reason we came back was because we felt like this was where we wanted to raise our family, where this is where we belonged. Even though we didn't have any earthly ties here, we felt like we had a lot of heavenly ties, and we felt like this was definitely home for us.
They had so many ideas and so much talent, you know, that they just made it something that was wonderful. And I think that that was one of the things that made the bus program such a success. Well,
when I first moved here, we were running 10 buses, We were running our buses on Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday nights. So it was pretty well full-time work for anybody that was involved in the bus program. And we had a lot of people who were very, very active. I remember every Saturday morning before we went out to knock buses, we'd come down, we'd have a short devotional, then we'd all go out on our respective bus routes, knock doors, and recruit children, and meet back up here for lunch. And some of the women in the congregation took turns and fixed lunches, and I can remember everybody, their favorite lunch on the days we were going to have white beans and cornbread. Boy, I mean, we had about 50 people come and knock doors so they could have their white beans and cornbread. I'd never eaten white beans that much, and so to me it was no big thrill, but that's what they really thought. You know, but everybody was really excited about the bus ministry, and so there were a lot of people who were very involved, a lot of people who literally wore themselves out on those bus routes because they were hot, they were long, and they were tiring. But it was also probably one of the most exciting periods of growth here at 7th and Mueller.
Also in 1978, Brother Eddie Lewis and his family left the 7th and Mueller Church. Larry McFadden became minister of the 7th and Mueller Church of Christ in 1978.
In 1978, Sue and I and the 3 children we had at that time were living in Midway, which is off down in Jackson County. We were working with that country congregation. The congregation, I think had about 150 people when we first went there. We were there 2 years. And we started a bus ministry. Of course, you know what that always does. And our numbers increased to around 285 or so in attendance. And it was just about that time that we started doing some work with the children's home, keeping foster children in our home. And somehow we made contact with this congregation through the children's home. I've always assumed that probably it was because of the children that we kept in our home and because of our involvement in a bus ministry that we were asked to come here. And I suspect Vance Greenway was probably behind that, although there were several elders involved at that time. But I've always known that the children's home was Vance's pet project. And I've always suspected that probably was the reason. When I first came here in March of that year to try out, I still didn't really know how to preach a sermon, I guess, and I wasn't real sure I wanted to come off to Paragould, Arkansas. That was a long way from home for a country boy. But things worked out pretty well. And in June, the very first Sunday in June, in fact, we came here. We moved our group of children with us, and at that time we had 5. No, excuse me, we only had 4. We had several other children, but we came with 4 children when we came in 78 in June. And that was, 20 and a half years ago, and things have just kind of come a long way since then. My hair's turned white. At that time it was still very dark, and lots of it, I might add. Not that I'm losing any now, just try to keep it cut a little shorter than it did back then. We came to a congregation that was already fully grown in a number of ministries. They were doing a lot of things right, and there were a lot of good people here. It's been my privilege over the years to serve under 15 different elders in this congregation. Now, some of them are gone. There are 3 of them, Gus Eubanks and Raymond Meadows and Vance Greenway, who now have passed away. And then others who still meet with this congregation would include Noel Jedon and Buddy Woodward and Boyd Leith, Jay McDaniel, and Johnny Wilkins and Morris Hurd. And then, of course, there are the 6 elders who presently serve. And they've all been good men. I think back over those we lost. Of course, Vance was the visionary, the one who always knew what ought to be done down the road, you know, and planned ahead for it. Gus was the man who always had an eye out for the people involved, and he was always concerned about the cost of things. He had a very practical turn of mind, and he was able to produce a great deal of good in his time served as an elder. And then Raymond Meadows. Raymond was an elder for such a short time, but of course, he had always been here, it seemed to me, and he was a motivator. He was an encourager. And he did those things for me as well as for a number of other people. And then the other men who are still here, you can still see the evidence of their work going on, the visiting they do, the work in the classrooms, and various other things that those men do just to play their roles, their part as Christians. They were all good elders. There have been some other men who've served. There were several full-time men that I've worked with over the years. There was Norman Childs and Sonny. But I should go back and tell you that Jim Short was full-time man before that. And, of course, Jim went off back to Alabama, thought he wanted to go there, and discovered that Paragould was home. So he came back after a short time and has worked on a part-time basis ever since here. There was Joe Cabrera, served as a youth minister, and Michael Cox, of course, who worked for, about 5 years here, I guess, and Roger Utter, and now Willie Sandlin. Of course, the part-time people who, as I recall, would include Jim Short and Roy Thomas and Telfer Campbell. And those three men are working right now in their various ministries, and we look for good from their ministries, and we see that good because they are doing a tremendous job in what they're doing. Some of the works that this church has been involved in over these 20 or so years that I've been involved with it, of course, include the old ministries of the children's home and the academy and the college. And those are important things. The camp has been an important part of my life during these 20-some years. The building projects that have taken place would include around, 1985, our present adult education building and the kitchen, and that has served as a tremendous boost to our fellowship. It's been an outstanding place for us to share even with the community. Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, even for a time, there was a kindergarten. In fact, 4 kindergartens who were meeting in that adult complex.
The Seventh and Mueller Church of Christ has always been known for its good benevolent program. The benevolent program takes place here daily at the Compassion Outreach Building. The Compassion Outreach Building was built in the mid-1990s. Each year, we have our annual sew-in, our annual shoe drive, and we hand out Christmas baskets to the people of the city of Paragould who are less fortunate.
Well, we had a benevolent program of us, in a sense, in the old building. And we had food and clothing. And that's just about all we did have. It was not nearly adequate. I mean, it was you just didn't have room to do much of anything. While we did real good, those ladies that worked in that program back then were wonderful. They did a tremendous job, did a lot of work.
Compassion Outreach reaches into the homes of people. It goes to their kitchens with our sew-in, our clothing giveaway every year, and our shoe drive, that giveaway every year. We go into the closets of people. The furniture puts us in their living rooms and their bedrooms. All of the work that's done in the Compassion Outreach is an outreach to the people of this community.
We have lots of people helping us now that work hard, love the program, they love to help people, they love people. And we have dedicated workers today just like we did back then.
Seventh and Mueller has always been interested in missions. Over the 50-year history of the church, Seventh and Mueller has helped send missionaries to Japan, France, Costa Rica, Africa, Guyana, Greece, the Philippines, and the United States.
But the first missionary that I remember was Joe Bryant and his wife, which I believe that was Emmett Smith's brother-in-law. And we sent them to Japan. Then Joe Betts and Ruth came along and wanted to go to Japan. And the elders asked me to be the treasurer, to handle the funds. And they went out throughout Central Arkansas and raised money to send them over there and for them to live and so on. And places like where Emmett Smith came from, where he was born and reared down there. Why, Emmett encouraged those people to be involved, and so he just, one church after another one. I wouldn't be surprised in what there's 15 or 20 congregations that wanted to have a part in Joe Betts and Ruth going there, and they are still there, connected now with Ibaraki Christian College. And Joe has had a wonderful influence on the church in Japan.
Back in the early 70s, the work in Kenya began, and of course it continued for quite a while under that first team that went. Galen Van Reenen, of course, was sponsored by this congregation along with Becky. And then from this area there was Field and Allison, of course, and Janet. And together with the other members of that team, they began a good work. Took them a long time to learn the language, to learn the culture, and to begin that work. But it was productive. And then, of course, we had a part in sending out the second team because Eddie and Kathy Rogers were sponsored by the Seventh and Mueller Church when they went to replace that first team that had been working among the Kipsigis for so long. And I had the privilege in December of 1996, and then on in through January of 97, to be in Kenya and then over into Uganda, where Darren Smith, another of our young people from Seventh and Mueller, is now a seasoned missionary. And I had the privilege of being there and looking at his work and being a part of that. But the work among the Kipsigis, of course, is a greater work. It's an older work, and it's one which is close to my heart because I've come to know the people. Enjoyed getting better acquainted with Galen himself, with Eddie and Kathy during the time that I was there, and getting acquainted with the people who are Christians. They're still first-generation Christians, most of them, but they're willing to take over the leadership of the Syriac Bible School that we have helped to fund and to build, and I've taught some courses there, and we're already involved in letting that work take the Kipsigis Christians through the next phase of their Christianity. We don't have any missionaries left there now from America. All the missionaries have gone to other tribes or they've come back home. And the people among the Kipsigis now are ready to take over and see to it that they don't miss a step in their continued growth, and they're still starting churches and making churches grow all over the place. The work in Costa Rica, Central America, that we're getting more and more involved in is going quite well, and that excites me, and I expect to have a more active part in that work as time goes on, and look for a tremendous number of churches to be started and souls to be saved as a result of it. In the 90s, since I've been here, the Newton Street congregation, we had a part in that, along with folks from Center Hill and other places who banded together, and some of our folks deliberately went, and some decided they would stay a year or 2 years. Others said, we'll stay as long as it takes. And that work is beginning to see some good effect, and I'm glad for that. And we need to continue our prayers in that regard.
You know, it's hard to believe that 50 years ago, Christians met here for the first time at the corner of 7th and Mueller. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear Brother Emmett as he stands there in the pulpit preaching that very first sermon. You can hear Brother Doug as he stands in the second building preaching a story about the resurrection. You can also hear Brother Claude in the new building that very first Sunday morning. And what about Brother Eddie as he stood there with those big, huge thermometers that taught us to meet our goals and challenges? And what about Brother Larry as he has for the past 20 years standing and preaching God's Word? You know, we have so much to be thankful for and so much to be blessed for. Let's continue our work here at 7th and Mueller, and let's make the next 50 years the best ever.
I have stood 1,000 feet above the valley, on a mountain peak that almost touched the sky, and felt the evening breeze as it whispered through the pines, beheld the midnight stars as they blazed away the the night, but there are no words that can tell of your love. There are no words that can speak of your works. There are no words that can rightly say what you have done for me. And how could I begin to give you praise when there are no words? Like an instrument that waits upon the player, Lord, pick me up and tune my soul to you. Like a brush that's in the hands of a painter, Lord, the colors in my life belong to you. And there are no words that can tell of your love. There are no words that can speak of your works. There are no words that can rightly say what you have done for me. And how could I begin to give you praise when there are no words?
Our Lord's family. To worship God, a few strong Christians met together at Mueller and 7th Street. Though 50 years have passed, we meet there yet to worship God and Satan's plans defeat. Our Lord's family has grown in number here in fellowship and singing, praying too. Our love for God and others keeps us near, a family worship with God in view. Each year death takes upon our group its toll that leaves an ache and tear in eye and heart. Let's never forget our final goal, a home where God and Christians never part. And mission-minded we should always be, the gospel take to the lost on land or sea. Cleo Von Heath, 1998.
This is a production of the Seventh and Mueller Church of Christ.